I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Tonight's conversation, I think, sits at the intersection of energy, trade, and geopolitics, and more importantly, at the intersection, I think, of realism and ideology, because my guest tonight is Rick Anderson. He's a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. He's a principal at E4 Strategies, is a publisher of something called Cathari News, and he's a longtime voice in Canada's energy and policy community, including as a former director of the Canadian Hydrogen Association. Rick is not an ideologue. He's not a cheerleader. He's not interested in, I think, comforting narratives. What he's writing about and he's challenging people on is whether Canada is actually adapting to a world where power has shifted, alliances are under strain, and old assumptions about trade, security, and energy no longer hold. He's argued recently that Canada cannot keep all of its eggs in a risk-free status quo, that global trade is fragmenting, not expanding, that the U.S. is no longer a reliably aligned partner in the way it once was, and that pretending otherwise is not a strategy, it's avoidance. At the same time, Rick has been clear-eyed about opportunity. He's talked about Asia and Europe. He's talked about Canada's enormous untapped clean energy potential. He's talked about the need for pragmatic partnerships across the world. And he's talked about the difference between, and this is great, and I want to ask him about this, performative compliance and real economic sovereignty. This isn't a conversation about left versus right. It's about Canada and where Canada is going to go in the future. Rick Anderson, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for the invitation, Brian. Looking forward to our conversation.
You've been very prolific in posting on LinkedIn and other places recently about the danger of Canada clinging to what you called a risk-free status quo. What do you mean by that? And why is it becoming even more dangerous now?
Well, the status quo I'm referring to, of course, is the prevalence of free trade, freer trade at least, that we've known in Canada since the 1980s. The irony of it is, you'll remember this, Brian, you're almost as old as I am, that, when we actually entered the free trade, when Canada actually entered the free trade era, it was through the free trade agreement that the Brian Mulroney government negotiated in 1988. And we had a highly, highly, highly contentious election that year, 1988. About whether or not we should proceed with that. And now it's something that we very much regret the possible passing away of. So it was 40 years of prosperity and success for Canada, growth, employment, and so on, that was really fueled by our embrace of freer trade, thanks to Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney back in the day. So that's the status quo I'm referring to. It's not really the status quo in the longer sense of the word. That would be kind of a reference to the post-war world order, where America emerged from the Second World War as the predominant world power, provided the nuclear shield that kept the West safe during the Cold War era until the Berlin Wall came down and the Warsaw Pact evaporated. And that American leadership during that period of time was a period of inclusion of other countries, of the Allies, and of kind of benevolent leadership, that really were allies and trade partners and so on, particularly Canada for geographic and cultural and familial reasons. But that seems to have, all been discarded by Donald Trump. He just doesn't believe in free trade. He doesn't really believe in NATO. He doesn't really believe in the West as an alliance. He says he does some days, and then the rest of the time he behaves quite differently. So that's what we've seen. That's what we're seeing rupturing, in the words of Mark Carney. And I think it's very regrettable. But anyway, it is the stat. It is the reality, at least for this period of time, and we need to face up to that instead of hiding away from it.
You raised that famous election in 1988. John Turner, the leader of the Liberal Party at the time, the leader of the official opposition, famously said something along the lines of, if you give away your economic sovereignty, eventually your political sovereignty will be challenged. Was John Turner right?
Yes. I mean, economics are the foundation of good social policy, which Canada is we're quite attached to our social policy in Canada, our healthcare and education systems, and so on. But the economy is the foundation for that. If you've got a weak economy, you're going to have weak social programs. And the same thing goes for sovereignty. If your economy is weak, if you're not able to employ people and give them a chance at prosperity and so on, you're going to face sovereignty movements, independence movements, and external pressures. Trump is playing those cards against us these days. It's a tremendous reversal of the traditional relationship between Canada and the States, except for those incidents back in the 1774 era and the 1812, where we're actually in conflict with the Americans. But that's 170 years ago. We've grown used to a completely different relationship with the United States, and we're really not experiencing that relationship anymore. It's very different today.
Well, wasn't it the 1890s when McKinley was making threats on Canada, and then I can't remember. You'll know better than I. Laurier was recommending reciprocity with the United States, and the U.S. turned it down.
That's true. There's also Benjamin Franklin. It's a great book by Margaret Drohan, come out a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, I think now. I think it's called He Failed to Conquer, the he being a reference to Benjamin Franklin, who in the days just preceding the Revolutionary War, 1774, 1775, led an expedition into Canada with what they called the Continental Army. That's what Washington's army was called, the Continental Army, notably. Not the National Army, not the Colonial Army, but the Continental Army. Benjamin Franklin led an expedition into Canada and actually captured Montreal and captured Trois-Rivières. And so they were heading for Quebec City, and they failed to, and that's the reference in the book's title, they failed to capture Quebec City. But had they done that at that point in time, we would have been the 14th colony, which is what they were looking for Canada, for the colonial break with Britain and British North America to be complete, and the Canadian part of it to be part of the American colonies. Well, they lost that battle. They tried again in 1812 and lost that again to the British Army. So we do have some history there, but it's not a history that anybody has any real solid remembrance of. And the actual time that we've spent since then has been very different in terms of our relationship with America until today.
I had the privilege of interviewing her about her book, and it was really quite a fascinating conversation. And she described numerous attempts that Benjamin Franklin had, not only his Continental Army invasion of Montreal, where he famously held court in a big armchair in some fancy downtown Montreal men's club, but negotiated in Paris in the agreements between England and the United States in regards to allowing the United States to separate. That one of the conditions that Benjamin Franklin was demanding for a long period of time was that Canada would be granted to the United States. So he tried numerous different times. And I do think that Trump remembers a lot of things about McKinley, regrettably. Trade, tariffs, and taking over Canada being some of them. But you've also pushed back on this whole idea about this Beijing, center of influence, and suggested it really is because of Trump and his policies and his tariff fights against numerous different countries that have created this situation, not necessarily what some people have suggested, which is Beijing's desire to have a sphere of influence. Tell me about that if you could.
Well, I mean, the natural response for Canada, in the wake of what's happening with our trade relationship with America, is to go out and seek, more diverse set of economic relationships, trade and investment relationships around the world. And we've always been pretty good at that. Prime ministers from Mulroney to Harper to Justin Trudeau have really furthered free trade agreements with between Canada and most of the rest of the world. We're the only G7 country that has trade agreements with all the other G7 members. We've got more trade agreements with more countries around the world than anybody else. We're a trading nation, and the Americans under Donald Trump are basically an anti-trade country. They're not a free trade country, and that's the rupture with the status quo that really I keep coming back to. So it's natural for us, given that our most significant trading relationship is being shredded. The President of the United States is violating the trade agreement he himself negotiated with us 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and leaving and telling us he doesn't need any of our products, which isn't true. To ask Manhattan what it will do without Canadian electricity. Ask farmers in the States what they will do without Canadian potash. Ask, all those refineries in the Gulf Coast where they get their oil. Ask the LNG plants in the Gulf Coast where they get the natural gas to turn into LNG and ship to Europe. These are all things that America is buying from Canada, not because we make them, but because they choose to, because they're good business for them. And he's telling us he doesn't need any of that or want any of that. America doesn't need or want any of that, even though millions of transactions a day say otherwise. But so the natural thing for us to do, the essential thing for us to do, is to go find replacement trade partners. And so Prime Minister Carney has been doing, I think, a terrific job strengthening our relationship with the EU, with whom we have a trade relationship, strengthening, rehabilitating relationships with China and India and Saudi Arabia that have become kind of tattered over, basically political issues in the last decade. And that China agreement that you were just referring to is one of those. I think it's a terrific agreement for Canada. For one thing, it alleviates some very painful tariffs that China had applied. The background is that we copycatted America in imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese vehicles, Chinese electric vehicles. That was an American idea. Basically, tariffs are an American idea these days, not a Canadian idea. And opposition to EVs is a Trump MAGA kind of idea, not a Canadian idea. And we copycatted that. It was a terrible mistake for us. We shouldn't have bothered having a 100% tariff on Chinese vehicles to begin with. But when we did introduce those a year or so ago, the Chinese retaliated and they punished Canadian farmers and fishers with 100% tariffs on our canola, which is one of our biggest exports, and on seafood. So we ended up having a stupid policy, 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, damaging to Canadian consumers who should have the advantage of being able to buy those cars if they wish to, and damaging to Canadian farmers who paid the price for our action against China. So I'm glad that Carney went to Beijing. I'm glad he's starting to build a process of, having a better relationship between Canada and China, which really got chilled over the years. And
Premier Ford has been very negative about this strategy, given that the argument for the 100% tariff was that it was to protect the North American car industry and EVs. It wasn't going to stop EVs; it was going to stop Chinese EVs and hopefully have the North American car industry, that is Canada and the United States, produce those EVs. And Ford thinks that this was a travesty, that we're now going to decimate the Canadian and American auto industry. What's your response to that?
well, I have a lot of time for Doug Ford. I think he's a pretty good premier generally. But he's quite wrong about that. The American administration is putting a lot of pressure on American car companies to pull out of Canada. That's what all that rhetoric means. That's what those tariffs means. He doesn't want Canadians to buy to manufacture cars that are shipped to the States. He says they don't need them, um, and they don't want them. So we need to adapt to that too. We can't just pretend he's not saying those things and actually doing those things, and that the companies aren't responding. If you look at what's going on, they're already cutting back shifts, they're already cutting back models, and they're already diverting investment into the States. The three American car companies are doing that. So I don't think we should be applying tariffs to China in order to protect American car companies, which is kind of what we got lobbied into doing there. I think it was a mistake. I'm all with Doug Ford and everybody else, Prime Minister Carney as well, and trying to figure out what we're going to do with the Canadian car business, auto business. It's our second largest, third largest area of exports after energy and food, and it's a significant employer. Especially in Ontario, which is why Doug Ford is so preoccupied with it. But it's important to the country. We have five companies that make cars in Canada. Two of them are Asian, Honda and Toyota. They assemble 70% of the cars that are made in Canada. The three American companies only produce 30% of the cars that are produced in Canada. And we need to start looking for other people to come here and manufacture cars here. We're terrific at making parts, and that's really, frankly, the biggest part of the auto sector for Canada is parts manufacturing. We're very good at that. But parts manufacturing feeds auto assembly, and we should figure out what we're going to do if, in fact, those American car companies stop making cars in Canada. How are we going to replace those jobs? And it's probably going to be with people from Asia and Asia and Europe. And we should be out shopping for people who want to invest in that.
You and Carney have been talking about trade diversification. Is that at all realistic, given that 70% or more of our trade is with the United States right now? You take every single other country and you don't add up to what we trade with the United States. And you've got politicians, Pierre Poilievre and others that are, almost suggesting we just got to sign up a new agreement with the United States no matter what. So how realistic is it that we can actually diversify our trade away from the United States?
Well, the government, of course, the federal government, the Carney government, is saying that they're hopeful of signing a new trade agreement or an extended CUSMA agreement, the Canada-U.S.-Mexican agreement, with the Trump administration, with one caveat, that they're not going to sign a deal that's bad for Canada. And what we see is that most of the trade deals that Trump has signed with other countries are inferior to what the Canadian relationship is. And if that's what he's hoping we're going to sign with him, I think we're probably, not necessarily going to do that. Basically, those deals take zero tariffs, which is what we're paying on 70 something percent of our trade with the United States, and replace them with across the board tariffs of 10 or 20% plus other exceptional tariffs on specific sectors and products. So it's a much that would be that's what other countries are negotiating with Donald Trump, and we've resisted doing that. We've refused to do that so far, and we're probably going to end up with some form of CUSMA agreement after this review. Although the president likes to say it's optional as far as they're concerned, so we might not even have that agreement, or if we do, it will probably be on terms that are inferior to what we enjoy right now. So we need to be actually doing something to diversify. I mean, it's not going to probably our trade with the United States is probably not going to go from 78% of our trade to 0%. It's not going to be 78% unless Donald Trump leaves office in a year or two, and isn't succeeded by some other mega anti-trade person with the same sort of set of ideas. We need to stop engaging in wishful thinking about this and about our ability to ensure that volume of trade is going to be there. It's not going to be there.
Do you think that we're engaged in wishful thinking? You actually wrote, which I was surprised about. You said that binding ourselves closer to the U.S. right now could actually cost Canadian sovereignty. That's a strong claim. That's a strong statement, sir.
Well, I think it's an accurate statement. It's a dangerous thing. It would be a dangerous thing for us to do. I mean, look at what the administration's talking about this week, encouraging separatism in Alberta, meeting with separatist leaders behind closed doors. I mean, these are things that are very aggressive in terms of the Canadian relationship. I'm old enough to remember when Charles de Gaulle was in Montreal during, I think it was during Expo 67. It was during the centennial year anyway. And he stood on a balcony on Place Jacques-Cartier in Montreal and said, "Vive le Québec libre." And the Prime Minister of the day, Lester Pearson, gave him a call and said, "Leave the country." What the Americans have done with Alberta, or the American administration is doing with Alberta separatists, is tantamount to the same thing. We shouldn't put up with it, and we're not putting up with it. We're already complaining about it. But the fact that they would do that and engage in those conversations and talk about them and use them basically as a threat against us is the kind of thing we need to be paying attention to. This is not the America that we have known for the last, all of our lifetimes. This is a very different beast. And Trump
Some
doesn't
people
really
say,
respect, he doesn't really respect any of the allies, any of America's allies. Look what he said about the soldiers who gave up their lives in Afghanistan at the request of the United States. He just doesn't have respect for the allies, not for the NATO alliance, not for free trade agreements, not for the EU. The way they talk about the European Union, a civilization in the process of destroying itself. What a ridiculous comment. What an offensive comment. And what a wrong-headed comment. It's just not true. Europe is way ahead of America right now in terms of social cohesion, healthcare outcomes, education, income equality. And J.D. Vance and the president of the United States talk about it like it's a disaster zone. It's not at all. It's way ahead of North America on half a dozen fronts.
some people say, just wait it out. Wait till the midterms. Wait till Trump's gone. Better forces, Democratic forces, or a more saner Republican Party will come to the fore.
Well, again, I mean, hopefully that's true. I mean, I wish that's true. That's called wishful thinking. So far, there's no real evidence of that happening. The president's approval ratings are falling, because the economy isn't as good as he's claiming. People are suffering high inflation. They're suffering job scarcity. They're destroying their own trade relationships, making their imports more expensive. I mean, he tells a story that when you listen to his litany of how things are going, it doesn't actually bear much resemblance to the actual facts on the table. America is in trouble thanks to his mismanagement of their economic and fiscal affairs. They've got the biggest deficit in American history. They're cutting people out of healthcare and social programs in the United States. Anyway, I hope you're right that the midterms or the next presidential cycle will change American politics back to something that we are more familiar with and something that's more sane. But we shouldn't count on that. This is the second time they've elected this president, and so far the opposition to him is not having much effect on what he's doing.
We're chatting tonight with Rick Anderson, who's got a long political history, a long business history about what's going on in Canada and the world today. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Rick Anderson with me tonight. He's a long political operative. I met him eons ago when he was a young liberal, and then he became Preston Mann-Eden's key person and was very involved in the Reform Party and the Alliance, and he's worked in politics in and out. He's worked in alternative energy, and he's just been a commentator on politics and what's going on from an economic standpoint in Canada that I've always admired. And so I really appreciate you joining us again tonight, Rick. Thank you so much. You've also written about this whole middle power strategy that I guess people have talked about for a while, but really came to the fore again with Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos. Is a middle power strategy of middle powers working together at all realistic? Similar to what, those Davos speeches, not just by Carney, but I guess by France and Germany and their leaders also echoed?
Well, your question seems like a valid one, Brian, but we don't get to decide this. The United States has already served notice on Europe that they will not be responsible for Europe's security after the end of 2027. That's only 2 years from now. So NATO needs to figure out. They haven't actually said they're leaving NATO, but they're acting like they're going to. And NATO's role is essentially, has been at least essentially, about the defense of the North Atlantic, meaning, North America and Europe. When he says America is going to not be responsible, that Europe needs to shoulder responsibility for its own defense, effective the end of 2027, 23 months from now, he's basically, in a way, walking away from NATO. So we need to be realistic about this. I mean, this is a president who says these things and sometimes doesn't do them. Many times doesn't do them. So that's a possibility here too. But actually does quite a few of the things. I mean, the tariffs that he told us he was going to do in his inaugural address a year ago is actually what he's doing. And all kinds of countries around the world are being subjected to, with who have had free trade agreements like Canada has with the America, are suddenly finding America breaching those agreements and putting in place something very different. He's talking about doing the same thing with the NATO alliance. The fact that he even threatened to take over territory from one of the NATO members, was just an incredible, unimaginable turn of events in terms of that Western alliance, which has been so essential to the keeping of the peace since 1945 for 80 years. So when he says he's going to pull out of the European side of that, what that means is that France and Britain and Germany and so on are going to have to figure out how to have their own nuclear shield. I mean, some of them are, France and Britain are nuclear powers, but they don't coordinate their nuclear missile fleet and match it with intelligence and so on. That's all. Those are NATO functions. And if the Americans are not going to be participants in that, or not going to be active participants in that, we really need to be making sure that Putin does not feel like he can go on from attacking Ukraine to attacking Poland and Lithuania and Latvia and the other border countries who used to be in the Soviet sphere, the Warsaw Pact, and are now very afraid that's what Putin is thinking of doing after Ukraine, or along with Ukraine, and that Europe very much needs to get its act together to defend against that. That's a real thing. That's not just a scenario that people are positing. That's real life in Europe right now, and we need to probably, Canada has signed an agreement with the EU now to participate in defense planning and in procurement with them. And we're doing that because of what Trump is doing to NATO and to our own relationship with America.
So part of Trump's argument is that Canada and Europe were freeloaders, that we didn't spend our 2% of GDP on defense, that Europe wasn't contributing as much as it should have been, as much as the United States was to the defense of Ukraine. That Germany was still almost a pacifist country and was freeloading. Is that justified? Is Trump right in suggesting that Europe has to do a lot more in regards to its own defense?
Yes, he's right about that. But it also isn't specifically a Trump idea. I mean, we've been agreeing on expanding, the NATO countries have been agreeing on expanding the share of GDP we each devote to our collective defense. We've been talking about doing that for 25 years. I mean, this goes back to the days of Paul Martin and John Krejci, and the first time NATO talked about a 2% of GDP target was something around 2004 or something, I can't remember, 20 years ago. And Trump was not yet, he was 15. That was 10 years before he got elected to anything. So he picked up that thread and said, we've made these commitments. He's right about that, and we should live up to them. He's right about that. And in fact, we need to do more than just live up to 2%. We need to be more serious, talk in terms of higher numbers, which has now become 5%. And Canada now has agreed to that goal, and so have most of the European countries. Poland is already, I think, spending something like 8% of its GDP on defense because they're next in line geographically to where Russia and Belarus are beating up on Ukraine. So this is not an academic discussion that we're having here. Russia is behaving. I mean, there's a lot of people waking up this morning or today in Kyiv and Ukraine where it's minus 20 degrees. And because of the shelling of the electricity system that the Russians have been doing for the last few months, they're living. These people are waking up without electricity, without the ability to cook meals, take the elevators up to their buildings or their office, up to their apartments or their offices, or to heat themselves. And that's actually happening. These are war crimes. These are attacks on civilian populations by a former superpower that wishes to be a superpower again in
A
Europe.
member of the UN Security Council.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't think they're an active member on it because, they're they're committing war crimes, and Putin's wanted, globally for that. But anyway, so the need for us to step up and take responsibility for our own defense is for sure there.
I had a fun interview with a gentleman from the Eurovision contest. Canada's applied to be a member of the Eurovision Song Contest. Now I understand there's talk about us becoming part of the EU. Should we become part of the European Union?
I don't know that that's. I would have personally no objection to it, but I don't think it's in the cards. Probably for geographic reasons as much as anything else. But there is a set of satellite countries called the European Free Trade Association with whom the EU does have trade agreements and other agreements. And of course, there's NATO, with or without America. So we will have those relations. I think we should think about joining EFTA and we do have a free trade agreement with Europe. It's in the process of being ratified on the European side. It's ratified on the Canadian side. So I think we should be drawing closer to Europe for sure, for sure, for sure. We have, good, strong cultural ties and economic ties with Europe and security ties with Europe and a lot of history. So we should be looking at doing everything we can to draw ourselves closer. But whether we join specifically the European Union, that's to me that's not the foremost question right now.
I was at a speech by Jean Charest, the former Premier of Quebec, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, and he said, in 20 years, we will thank Donald Trump because he's actually forcing us to do the things that we should have done anyway. What do you think of that, sir?
I think it's right. Jean Chrétien says the same thing in public events. Look, Canada's not perfect. It's pretty damn good, but it's not perfect. One of the things that we have a tendency to do is kick cans down the road instead of resolve them. We've got a constitutional amending formula that doesn't really work for the country. We've got an equalization program that's probably doing more harm than good at the scale it's operating and with the formula it's being used. We need to fix those things. We need to make sure that we follow through on our Indigenous reconciliation initiatives and not leave people in dire straits for another half a century. So there's a bunch of issues in Canada that we kind of know about, but don't necessarily resolve. And we've got to get out of that habit and be more agile, be more expeditious in solving problems and really resolving problems. We shouldn't have separatist movements in two provinces in this country. That's unhealthy. We should figure out what's wrong with those relationships. I think the one in Western Canada right now is the more dire one. I don't think there's going to be a referendum in Quebec this year, even though the Parti Québécois has promised one, should they be elected. I don't think Quebecers are at all interested in leaving Canada while we have this kind of confrontation with Donald Trump and America going on. But the Western movement, while not strong, is noisy and well funded. I mean, it's really a strange phenomenon to have a separatist movement in a country that's basically the wealthiest people in the wealthiest part of the country leading the way, because that's what's going on in Alberta. And it's really about money. They don't put it that way, but that's ultimately what it comes down to. Canada has dilly-dallied about helping Alberta get its resources to market a little too often. The Energy East pipeline cancellation or blockage at the hands of the province of Quebec was received extremely badly in Alberta, and it's never been corrected. Basically, it's resource exports mostly from Alberta, oil exports mostly from Alberta that help fund our equalization program, of which Quebec is the biggest beneficiary. And they turn around and say, well, you can't take your pipeline through Quebec. You can send your oil through the States or through BC, but you can't bring it through Quebec. Uh, you know, I think that was an extremely unfortunate political occurrence. Anyway, we've got a lot of fence mending to do in the country. I think the Prime Minister and the premiers are very conscious of that. I hope they get serious about the One Canada economy, the interprovincial trade barriers. I hope they get. I hope they follow through on that. I worry that it's dragging a little bit. And we can't let that happen. We need to figure out how to open up our internal trade as well as expand external, diversify and expand our trade relationships abroad.
Well, we've been focusing primarily on the United States. You've just mentioned things that Canada's got to do and change. Let's take a break and come back and talk a little bit more about Indigenous relations that you've talked about, separatist movements. I think that we really got to focus on what we can do in Canada to change ourselves. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Having what I think is a really important conversation with Rick Anderson tonight. We've talked about Canada's relationship with the United States. We talked about Canada's, existence as a middle power and our relationship with Europe. We haven't talked about China. I want to come back to that if we have time. I think what you've said is that you congratulate and agree with what Prime Minister Carney's done on his recent trip to China. But let's talk about Canada for a second. I've spent the last 10 days traveling in Western Canada and Alberta and British Columbia. And I have been shocked at some of the reactions, particularly from people in Alberta, in regards to separation. And you've commented about Quebec and their disagreement, but lots of even more vehement comments about the Premier of British Columbia and Indigenous groups that are appearing to restrict the ability of getting oil and natural gas to markets. Tell me what you think we've got to do in that regard.
With respect to Alberta specifically?
Yeah, and you've commented about. I think that you've said that Indigenous people really aren't against development. We just have to negotiate with them correctly.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And the good news is on that front, there's been a lot of progress, probably more progress in the last 20 years than in the last 120 years with respect to economic reconciliation, Indigenous economic reconciliation. We've always had a kind of practice. I think 10 years ago, if you asked the mining companies and the forestry companies and the energy companies in Canada, you would have found that there was then something like 800 economic benefit agreements that individual companies have signed with individual First Nations across the country that offer jobs and training and contracts and shared revenue and so on. Some of those worked pretty well. Some of them were less successful. So it's quite a spectrum. But the nature of those agreements, they've been expanding in size and scope and volume. I mean, the granddaddy of First Nations agreements, of economic agreements with First Nations in Canada, is Quebec and the James Bay Project, which made the Cree of Northern Quebec one of the wealthiest First Nations in the world. They have an airline, they have a construction company, they have ongoing revenues from what's still expanding, the James Bay hydroelectric projects and so on. The next biggest group of success stories is in northeastern Alberta in the Athabasca region north of Fort McMurray, where half a dozen First Nations have received something like $3 billion over the last 20 years from the oil sands companies. And that's of course life-changing for those communities. And you're starting to see right across the country in Ontario now, electricity expansion, which is going on all the time, OPG is always engaging first with Indigenous First Nations, who are the ones immediately impacted by whatever they're planning to do, and they're signing agreements about those. And those are more co-equal agreements than the old ones, which used to be kind of 5 or 10% shares or revenue or something like that. These are more robust agreements, and we see them in BC and Alberta. We see them increasingly right across the country. And that's very good news. We've got a generation of Indigenous leaders across the country who are becoming really good at business,
So
and
what's the
not just.
implication of that in regards to taking oil to the BC coast? Is it we're just Alberta, BC aren't offering enough money?
Um, well, if you're talking about the MOU that the federal government and the memorandum of understanding that the federal government and Alberta recently signed, they talked about expanding oil exports from the BC West Coast in two ways. One is by further expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which we just got through expanding already just last year. So that's probably in line for further expansion to tune of another 300,000 or 400,000 barrels a day. And that MOU also specified that the two governments would work together with First Nations to explore the idea of a northwest, not another pipeline across BC to the west coast and exporting oil to Asia. And that the two governments are working on that. They've got a timetable in front of them. Certain things need to be done by April the 1st, and more things need to be done by July. I think it's July the 1st or June the 1st. So that's an active those are active projects. So on the question that you're asking, though, specifically about the Indigenous relationships, I think the success of that initiative, of the additional pipeline, not the expansion one, but the additional pipeline, is very much going to come down to whether there is a First Nation or First Nations who want to host that project on their land. And if there is, I think it will go ahead. If there isn't, I think it probably won't go ahead. And so, really, job one right now for the Premier of Alberta and the Prime Minister of Canada and the companies who are interested in being part of this is exploring. I'm sure that's what they're all doing with First Nations in the west coast of BC, whether or not they're receptive to the idea of a project like that happening on their territory. And if they agree, that's what will happen. You know, the recent history there is that we've seen First Nations in Kitimat and up near Prince Rupert, north of Prince Rupert, become front and center in LNG projects in Kitimat and already operating now. LNG Canada went into operation. Canada's first big LNG project went into operation last year. These are already having material impacts on Canada's national GDP as well as the First Nations who are part of it. The Haisla are the partners in LNG Canada and the projects in Kitimat. And the Nisga'a First Nation, right up there in the the high northwest corner of BC, right on the coast, are the leading. They're the Ksi Lism's LNG project, which is another one of the projects that's on the federal government's major projects list. That's a Nisga'a led and backed by Canadian gas companies project, which is probably going to go ahead. So those are two big. And Squamish also in Squamish, BC, Squamish First Nation is a partner in an LNG plant there. So there's a growing history of West Coast Indigenous nations being partners in energy projects already. And I think the oil pipeline will only proceed if it's on that same model.
I'm negotiating with some Indigenous groups in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and I agree with you. I think that kind of economic partnership can, with good negotiations and good intentions, succeed. What about though Premier Eby? You didn't mention him and his role in that negotiation. Has he been sidelined? Should he be more included?
I think he was not part of the initial development of that MOU, and of course he expressed some irritation about that. Since then, I think that it's become more of a four-way conversation with the federal government, the Alberta government, the BC government, and the First Nations, who really, as I say, will probably decide whether or not that next oil pipeline project happens and where it happens. But I think Premier Eby would prefer not to have the political controversy that an oil pipeline engenders in BC to deal with. But I think that he's become a bit more open-minded in his comments about it. But he was probably justified in expressing irritation at being not being brought into the conversation a little bit earlier. So we'll see where it goes.
I've got to ask you, if we have time, two more questions, if I could. You, in a recent post, used a really interesting, I don't know what you call it, a phrase, performative compliance. And you said that Canada was guilty of performative compliance rather than actually securing real outcomes. What do you mean by that?
Well, give credit where credit's due. That's not my phrase. I was quoting Mark Carney's speech in Davos, where he talked about performative compliance being basically a way to lose your sovereignty. And he was talking about countries signing deals with the Americans to concede to accept higher tariffs and restrictions on their trade and so on that were actually harmful to those countries. And there's an open question. I mean, the European community, for instance, said it was going to, I think, something like triple its LNG imports from the United States during a very short period of time. I think it was 3 or 4 years. I can't remember the terms of it right now. It would be impossible to scale up LNG exports in that time frame. And to me, that's kind of performative compliance. You're promising to do things that you don't want to do, and you probably can't even do. They're physically impossible in the time frames that they're talking about, as well as damaging. So we've seen a succession of countries and companies making deals with the President of the United States that they would normally not make and probably aren't in their interests. And Mr. Carney is referring to that performative compliance as basically undermining our sovereignty.
Last question, if I could. Are Canadians emotionally prepared for this changed world?
I think so. I think that, I mean, there's a spectrum, right? There's people who resist this kind of change and say this is just, we don't need to do this. This is going to go away. Trump will leave eventually. Things will return to normal. I think that's wishful thinking. And there are people who are probably overreacting and thinking it's the end of the world. And it's probably not that either. But in between that is what our governments are doing, which is hunkering down to improve our internal trade with one another in the country and open up more of that. Prime Minister Carney says if we really did that and took that seriously, we would more than replace the lost trade with the United States just in terms of our doing business with each other in different parts of the country. But secondly, that's the first leg of the government's response, the federal government's and the provincial government's response. Secondly, we all need to pitch in, all the companies in the country and all the exporters and all the provinces or exporting provinces, which are basically everybody, and expanding our trade opportunities with other countries. We export food to over 140 countries. And we're the first in a whole bunch of agri-food products in many categories, peas and lentils and so on, and grain. Canadians know some of this, but unless you're in the farming community, it's kind of an abstraction to you. But we're really a big deal in the agri-food business globally, and that benefits every single part of Canada because we produce food products of one sort or another in every province of the country. And the food and beverage processing industry is actually our fastest growing manufacturing sector in the country. So there's some good news there and some good opportunities for us. And I think our governments are getting focused on them, along with trying to preserve what we can of what's been a very positive relationship with the United States, trade and security and everything else, and try to keep as much of it as we can, but not just pretend that Donald Trump isn't saying the things he's saying and doing the things he's doing. We actually have to respond to the reality that he presents to us.
Some people think that Mark Carney's speech in Davos was brilliant and called for. Other people think, no, he just stuck something in Trump's eye, and it was a huge mistake to strike the bear. What do you think?
Well, I think the reason so many people find it brilliant is that they welcome the dose of reality that he brought to that meeting with that speech.
Rick Anderson, thanks so much. Really appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thanks very much, Brian. Talk to you again soon.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 a.m. You can stream me online, even from Davos or Ottawa at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, on podcast servers, on YouTube as soon as the radio show gets broadcast air. Thanks for joining me, everybody. Good night.